There is a castle at the edge of the world where the fires go out at dusk, not because there is no wood, not because there is no one to tend them, but because the man who rules it has learned, over 11 years, that light draws eyes, and eyes are the one thing he cannot survive. They called him the Demon King of Asheville Hold, and they said it the way people say the names of storms, with respect and with distance. What they did not say, because none of them had lived long enough to say it twice, was that the last person who saw what he became in the dark had not lived to describe it. A servant girl with no name worth remembering was about to be given a room in the West Wing. Anyway, she did not know yet that refusing to run would be the only unreasonable thing she ever did. She only knew that the alternative, being seen, being known, being handed back to the men who had already decided what she was worth, frightened her more than any shadow could. Asheville Hold kept its mornings the way it kept everything else, quietly, without ceremony, as though the castle itself had learned long ago that drawing attention to anything invited questions no one wanted to answer. Wren had come to like that quality about it in the 6 years since she'd first walked through its gate, with nothing but a stolen name and a memory of orchards she was trying very hard to forget. The stone floors were cold under her knees, no matter the season, and the brush were soft against her palms in a rhythm she no longer had to think about, and there was a peace in that, in work that asked nothing of her but her hands. Wren had been scrubbing the same stretch of floor for the better part of an hour when the doors of Asheville Hold's receiving hall opened wide enough to let in a cold, and Lord Caswick of Larkspire walked through it like a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. She knew the crest on his cloak before she let herself look up, the black lark on gray wings folded, the sigil of the house that had raised her and then sold what was left of her for a treaty. She kept her eyes on the stone and her hands moving in slow circles, the way she had trained herself to disappear 100 times before. It did not work. It never worked when he was in the room, because Caswick had a way of finding the one servant whose face he recognized among 50 who had none. "You," he said, and the single word carried the whole hall's attention with it. "Girl, come here." She rose, because refusing was not a door that opened for someone like her. 6 years she had scrubbed floors and mended hems and eaten what was left after the court had eaten first, and in all that time she had built herself a name that fit in a servant's mouth without catching. Renee short for nothing anyone needed to ask about. Thackerswick looked at her now, the way he had looked at her the last time they stood in the same room, when he was signing away her father's lands and she was being led out a side door so no one would have to watch a princess become a maid in the same afternoon. "Still alive," he said, low enough that only she and the 2 guards flanking him could hear it. How disappointing for everyone who assumed the cold would finish what I started. Cold over cruelty. She would always choose cold over cruelty, and she told herself that now, holding her spine straight while he circled her once, slow cataloging the years on her face the way a merchant checks a horse's teeth, he was here as an envoy, some treaty renewal between Larkspire and Asheville Hold that had nothing to do with her, except that it had put her uncle in the one castle in the world she had run to, specifically because no one asked questions here. She had not accounted for treaties. She had not accounted for the possibility that the world was smaller than 6 years of scrubbing floors had made it feel. She remembered, unbidden, the last true conversation she'd had with her father, the night before Caswick's men came for the estate, his voice low in the study, telling her that whatever happened, she was to forget the name Larkspire entirely if forgetting it kept her breathing. She had not understood, at 11 years old, how thoroughly she would come to master that particular instruction. She understood it now, standing in a stranger's hall with her uncle's eyes cataloging every year she'd spent trying to disappear. "I wonder," Caswick said, loud enough now for the hall to hear, "what the Demon King would say if he knew one of his kitchen girls carried Larkspire blood. Stolen blood, at that. There's a bounty on it, you know. Rather a good one." The hall had gone quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet before something breaks. Wren felt the old fear rise in her the way it always had. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow closing of every exit she had ever counted. She thought of the last time a room had gone this quiet around her. The afternoon her father's seal had been broken in front of the assembled lords of Larkspire, and no one had looked at her at all, as though the loss of a title made a person genuinely difficult to see. She had learned something from that afternoon that she had never forgotten. Silence from a crowd was not mercy. It was simply people deciding all at once that whatever happened next was not their business to interrupt. Nothing to say? Caswick pressed, closer now, close enough that she could smell the traveling dust on his cloak, and beneath it something sweeter, wine perhaps, the particular confidence of a man who had never once had to apologize for taking what he wanted. "You used to talk a great deal more, as I recall, followed your father around like a shadow, always with some question or another. I confess I find the silence an improvement." "You would," she said, before she could stop herself, and regretted it instantly, not because it wasn't true, but because giving him a reaction was exactly the kind of currency he had always known how to spend against her. Caswick's smile widened, satisfied, the way a man is satisfied when a trap closes exactly as designed. "There she is," he said, almost fond, almost gentle, and that was somehow worse than the cruelty had been. "I did wonder if 6 years of floors had scrubbed the spine out of you entirely." She was already composing the shape of her next 6 years homeless when a voice cut through the hall that she had heard perhaps 4 times in as many years, always from behind a closed door, always low enough that she'd assumed it was a voice that did not care to be heard. "She serves me now." King Raven stood in the archway above the hall's east stair, still half in shadow the way he always kept himself, and the words landed in the room like a verdict nobody had asked for. Caswick's mouth opened and closed once before anything useful came out of it. The king did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. Wren felt every eye in the hall shift from her uncle to her, to the man in the archway and back again, and understood, with the particular vertigo of watching your own life get rewritten by someone else's sentence, that whatever had just happened to her had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with a king who did not explain himself to anyone. She hadn't expected that. Caswick recovered his composure with the ease of a man who had spent 30 years learning to lose gracefully in rooms where losing badly would cost him more. He bowed, shallow and correct, and said something about treaties and goodwill that Wren did not hear because her whole body was still ringing with the sound of a king's voice claiming her in front of a room full of people who would talk about it before the sun went down. When she looked up at the archway again, Raven was already gone, the space where he'd stood empty as a held breath. She scrubbed the last of the floor with hands that would not stop shaking, and told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not explain themselves. That did not mean they had reasons worth losing sleep over. But sleep found her slowly that night, regardless. In the narrow room she shared with 2 other maids, both of whom had already begun whispering the story into something larger than it was. A king who broke 11 years of silence for a floor scrubber, a servant with a bounty on her head, a lord humiliated in his own receiving hall. Wren lay on her back and listened to them trade theories in the dark. none of them close to true, and understood with a sinking clarity that whatever privacy she had built for herself over 6 careful years had just been cracked open in front of a hall full of witnesses. Dokiaswick would not let this go. Men like her uncle did not forget a public humiliation, they simply waited for a better room to avenge it in. She fell asleep eventually with her hand curled instinctively around the small cloth pouch she kept beneath her pillow. The one piece of larkspire she had never been able to make herself burn, a single pressed orchard blossom gone brittle with age, and dreamed, for the first time in years, of her father's voice. In the dream, he was not saying anything important, only reading to her from some old book of house history, his voice low and unhurried, the way it had always been before the world came apart around them. And she woke, in the gray hour before dawn, with the specific ache of having lost something twice. Once when it happened, and again every time she was foolish enough to dream about it. She lay still for a long while, listening to the other maids' even breathing, and made herself a private promise she had made 100 times before, and broken exactly as often, that she would not let herself hope for anything larger than survival, because hope, in her experience, was simply grief that hadn't happened yet. She was summoned to his study before the candles were lit, which in Ashvale Hold meant she was summoned early. The king kept to the last hour of daylight for anything that required his face to be seen, and Wren had learned enough of the castle's rhythms to know that this alone made the audience unusual. The study itself was sparer than she'd expected of a king's private chamber, shelves of ledgers rather than trophies, a single worn chair, no portraits, nothing that spoke of a man who wanted to be remembered by the room he kept. He sat behind a desk with his back to the window, so that what light remained fell around him rather than on him, and she understood, standing in the doorway with her hands folded the way 6 years of service had taught her, that this was a habit and not an accident. "You will attend the West Wing after dark," he said without preamble, without asking whether she wanted to. "You will bring what is needed to the outer chamber and leave it. You will not light a candle in the corridor beyond the 3rd door. You will not knock on the inner door, under any circumstance, no matter what you hear through it. You will not ask why." Wren had spent 6 years learning which orders came with an explanation attached and which ones did not, and this one, delivered in a voice that gave nothing away, was clearly the second kind. "And if I refuse, your grace?" Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but close to it, the particular stillness of a man unused to being questioned. "Then you go back to the kitchens, and your uncle collects his bounty within the week. I assume that arithmetic is not difficult." It wasn't. She had done the sum herself the moment Caswick said the word *bounty* in front of a room full of witnesses. There was no version of her life after this afternoon that did not involve either his protection or his indifference, and indifference, in Ashvale Hold, meant being handed back to a family that had already decided the most useful thing she could ever be was sold. "Why me?" she asked. Because it was the only question he hadn't forbidden. "There are 100 girls in this castle who don't have a bounty on their heads. Any of them would serve you without drawing your uncle's guard into a private feud." "Because the others would scream," Raven said, and something about the flatness of it told her it was not the whole truth, only the piece of it he was willing to hand over. "I need someone who has already decided that survival is worth more than curiosity. You struck me as someone who understands that arithmetic better than most." "That isn't an answer. That's a description of a tool you'd like to use." For a moment something almost like surprise crossed what little of his face the window's failing light allowed her to see. She was learning already that he did not expect to be argued with, and that the experience of it seemed to interest him more than offend him. "Fair?" he said after a pause long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "The truth is, I don't know why you, specifically. And I have watched you cross this castle for 6 years without once drawing attention to yourself, and today, in a hall full of people deciding what you were worth, you didn't flinch. I find I would like to know how a person learns to do that. I am not offering you an explanation, Ren. I am offering a room and protection, and the truth that I have very little left to give beyond those two things." She considered him for a long moment. The careful way he kept himself angled from the last of the light, the stillness that seemed less like calm and more like the discipline of a man holding something in check at all times. "And the rules," she said. "The corridor, the candle, the door. What happens if I break one by accident?" "Don't," he said. And for the first time, something in his voice cracked toward urgency rather than command. "Not by accident. Not on purpose. I am not offering you those rules to be difficult. I am offering them because I would like you to survive the winter. She should leave. She should refuse. She didn't." The terms, when she turned them over that night in the narrow servant's bed she'd slept in for 6 years, made a brutal kind of sense. His protection against her uncle's claim, a private room in a wing no other servant was permitted to enter, and in exchange, 3 rules that cost her nothing but curiosity. Whatever waited behind that inner door was the king's business, not hers, and she had spent 6 years perfecting the art of not asking questions that could get her killed. This would be no different. She told herself that, until she believed it enough to sleep, what she did not tell herself, because it seemed too dangerous a thought to let take root, was that she had wanted to say yes before he'd finished explaining the terms. Not for the protection, though the protection mattered, but for the strange, done familiar sensation of being asked a question by someone with power over her life, and finding that her answer genuinely seemed to matter to him. No one in 6 years had asked what she wanted. They had only ever told her what she was permitted. She fell asleep, turning that difference over like a coin too new to know the weight of yet. And in the morning, she packed the little she owned into a single bag and did not look back at the servant's wing she was leaving, because she had learned long ago that looking back only ever slowed a person down. The room she was given in the West Wing was larger than anything she had slept in since Larkspire. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single high window that let in a sliver of gray sky, and for the first several nights she found she could not sleep in it properly. Some old instinct, insisting that a room, this good, given this easily, must carry a debt she hadn't yet been told the size of. She kept her bag, packed by the door, out of habit for the better part of a fortnight, the way she had kept it packed through 6 years of servants' quarters, ready to vanish the moment vanishing became necessary again. It took her longer than she would have liked to admit before she finally unpacked it fully, folding what little she owned into the room's single chest of drawers, and even then she kept the small cloth pouch with the pressed orchard blossom tucked beneath her pillow. The rules in practice proved simpler to keep than she had feared. The corridor beyond the third door stayed dark by her own choosing, her feet learning its length without needing light to guide them. She never touched the inner door, though in the first weeks she found herself standing near it more than strictly necessary, listening to the low sounds that lived behind it and trying to imagine a shape to go with them. She did not ask why. She had promised she wouldn't, and she had built a life for 6 years out of keeping exactly that kind of promise, because the alternative, being the kind of person who asked questions that got her noticed, had never once served her well. The West Wing corridor stayed colder than the rest of the castle in a way that had nothing to do with drafts. And Ren learned within the first week that the cold sharpened after dusk, deepened with the dark, as though the stones themselves were bracing for something. She brought a covered tray to the outer chamber each night and set it on the small table by the unlit hearth, and each night, before she withdrew, she heard something from behind the inner door that she had no name for, a breathing too slow and too deep to belong to any man. A low sound in the back of a throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a word. She did not run. That alone seemed to matter, though she could not have said how she knew it. On the fourth night, setting down the tray, she heard the sound shift, not toward her exactly, but toward the door, as though whatever was on the other side of it had gone still to listen for the particular quiet of a girl who did not flee. She held her breath without meaning to. The silence stretched long enough that she began to count her own heartbeat, and when the low sound resumed, it was softer than before, almost, she told herself she was imagining it, almost relieved. By the second week she had learned the rhythm of the outer chamber well enough to move through it without needing the little light the third door's rule allowed her. The position of the table, the particular creak of the third floorboard, the cold draft that curled in from a window, she never saw, but always felt. She began arriving a little earlier each night, though she told herself this was only practicality, that a servant who knew her route by memory was a servant less likely to make a mistake. That might cost her the arrangement entirely. It had nothing to do, she insisted to herself, with the small, unfamiliar comfort of standing in a dark room and feeling for a few minutes each evening genuinely useful to someone. One night in the second month, she found herself lingering at the outer hearth longer than the tray required, feeding it a second log, though the rules said nothing about how long she was permitted to stay once her task was finished. Through the inner door she heard the low sound again, not a growl, this time. Something closer to a sigh, low and worn, the particular exhaustion of a creature carrying something too heavy for even a king's shoulders. Without quite deciding to, she found herself speaking into the dark, low enough that if he wasn't listening, it would cost her nothing. It isn't a mercy, you know, making yourself alone in the dark, so no one else has to be afraid of you. It's just a different kind of cruelty, aimed inward instead of out. The sound behind the door went very still, and she did not know, walking back down the cold corridor afterward, whether she had said too much or exactly enough. He noticed. She could tell, in the small ways a person tells anything about someone they are forbidden from looking at directly. The tray was always empty by the following evening. The fire in the outer hearth she was permitted to light burned a little longer before it needed tending, and once, only once, she found a single word scratched into the wax of a spent candle stub outside the inner door, *stay. She did not know if it was meant for her. She kept it anyway, tucked into the lining of her sleeve, the way she had once kept small pieces of her old life before she learned that, keeping things made, losing them hurt more. She had expected, walking into this arrangement, to spend her nights afraid. What she found instead, week after week, was something closer to peace, the strange, private peace of being trusted with a secret large enough to kill her, and choosing every single night to keep it anyway. She had been prepared for cruelty in this castle. She had not been prepared for this, a king who spoke to her only through doors and candle wax, and somehow made her feel less alone than 6 years among people who could see her face ever had. There was one night deep in the 3rd month when he spoke back, not through wax or silence, but in words, low and rough through the inner door, the first time she had heard his true voice outside the receiving hall's single sentence. "You should be afraid of me," he said, into the dark between them. "Everyone else has the sense to be. I have been afraid of people with perfectly ordinary faces," she answered. Without moving from where she sat against the outer chamber's cold stone wall, close enough to the door now that she no longer flinched at the sounds beyond it. My uncle has never once shifted into anything but himself, and he is the most frightening person I have ever known. I have stopped trusting fear to tell me who deserves it. There was a long silence after that, long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. Neither of them had named aloud. But when he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, rawer, closer to the version of himself she suspected very few people had ever heard. My brother used to say something similar. That the shape of a thing tells you less than the way it treats what it loves. A pause. I have not thought of him kindly in a long while. It is strange. Hearing you say something he might have said. Tell me about him, she said, gently. And he did. Not everything, not yet, but enough that by the time she left the West Wing that night, she understood she had been handed a piece of him larger than any she'd been given before, and that he had chosen. She walked the corridor back toward her own room that night, slower than usual, turning his brother's words over in her mind. The shape of a thing tells you less than the way it treats what it loves, and wondering, not for the first time, what shape her own life might have taken if even one person among the wreckage of Larkspire had believed something similar about her. She did not have an answer. She only knew that for the first time since her father's seal was broken, she had stopped bracing herself each night for the ground to shift beneath her, and had started, instead, to simply live in the days as they came. The days leading up to it had felt, in hindsight, subtly wrong. Raven's voice, through the inner door thinner than usual. The low sounds that had become almost familiar to her, now carrying an edge of strain she hadn't heard before. She told herself it was nothing, the way she had told herself a great many things were nothing over 6 careful years, and brought the tray each night regardless, because whatever was wrong on the other side of that door was still, in the end, none of her business to fix. The night the curse broke its usual boundaries, Wren had no warning beyond the wrongness of the silence, no growl, no breathing, nothing at all from behind the inner door, which frightened her more than any sound could have. She set the tray down with hands that had gone cold, despite the fire, and she was 3 steps from the outer door when it happened. The inner door did not open so much as it stopped existing as a barrier. Wood splintering inward, and the thing that came through it into the outer chamber's firelight was not a man. She had imagined, in 6 weeks of guessing, something like a wolf or a bear, or one of the old stories, Twisted Nights. She had not imagined the reality of it, the size, the wrongness of a silhouette, too tall and too broad for any human doorway, eyes that caught the firelight and threw it back the color of embers, claws where a king's hand should have been. Every instinct she had told her to run, and every instinct she had learned, in 6 years of surviving people worse than monsters, told her that running from a cornered thing was the surest way to die. So she stayed. The candles guttered and died one by one, as though the creature's presence itself was smothering the light, until the room held nothing but the last coals of the outer hearth and the shape of something enormous, breathing hard in the dark. Wren sank slowly to the floor, her back against the cold stone, and did the only thing she had left to offer a creature that could not be reasoned with and would not be outrun. She talked. She told him about Larkspire first, because it was the safest thing she owned, the parts of it she had never told anyone in this castle, the lullaby her mother used to hum over the hearth fires before Caswick's men came, the shape of the orchard behind the old keep, the way autumn smelled there before it smelled like anywhere else, sweet and smoke-touched. Nothing like the ashen stone smell of Ashvale holds winters. She kept her voice low and even, the way she might have gentled a spooked horse, though nothing about the shape breathing in the dark resembled a horse in any particular that mattered. When the breathing came closer, she made herself hold still rather than flinch away, and found with a kind of dazed surprise that some old animal part of her recognized the difference between a creature that wanted to hurt her and a creature that was simply, catastrophically, in pain. "I used to think," she said into the dark, "that the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing everything at once. My home, my name, everyone who was supposed to protect me." Her voice caught, but she kept going because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. "I don't think that anymore. I think the worst thing is losing it slowly enough that you start believing you deserved to." Something enormous shifted closer in the dark, and she felt heat against her side, not the heat of flame, but of a body running fever-hot, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched fur or scale or whatever the curse had made of him, and did not. Instead, she kept talking, softer, now circling back toward the lullaby, because it was the one thing in her memory that had never once been used against her. She sang it badly, her voice shaking on the low notes, the words half forgotten and rebuilt from fragments she'd carried for 6 years without ever singing aloud. Somewhere in the second verse, she felt the air in the room change, the enormous breathing slowing, the wrongness of the shadow easing back from the edges of her vision, the fever heat beside her cooling. By degrees, she could feel more than see. She did not stop singing. She sang it through twice more, and each time the shape beside her in the dark grew a little smaller, a little less impossible, until what remained breathing unsteadily against the cold stone floor was closer to the size and shape of a man than anything else. The room held the particular hush of a castle at its coldest hour, when even the wind outside seems to have gone still to listen. She could smell tallow smoke from the dead candles, and beneath it, faint something that might have been her own memory of an orchard she could not return to, conjured by nothing but the dark and the sound of her own voice singing a dead woman's song to a stranger she had promised never to look at directly. When the sun finally found the edge of the sky and the creature folded fully back into the shape of a man on the floor beside her, Wren did not move away. Raven knelt there in the gray half-light, breathing hard, human hands pressed flat to the stone as though he needed to remind himself they were hands again. And when he finally looked up, at her really looked. For the first time since she'd come to this wing, his voice broke on the first word he tried to say. "You stayed." "I noticed," she said, because it was true, and because 6 weeks of careful distance had just dissolved into something she didn't have a name for yet. "You said stay on the candle." He did not answer that. But something in his face, grief and disbelief, and underneath both of those, something that looked dangerously close to hope, told her he had not expected, after 11 years of emptying this wing every night, to ever hear someone say it back. They sat together on the cold floor as the gray light slowly warmed toward morning proper, neither of them in any hurry to move, and it was Raven who finally broke the silence a second time. "The last person who saw me like that," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed instead on his own hands, as though still not entirely convinced of their shape, "did not live to tell anyone about it. I have spent 11 years assuming that was simply the price of being near me during the worst of it. I am having some difficulty understanding why it wasn't this time." "Maybe the price was never the shape you become," Wren said carefully, "and always just whether anyone stayed to see the rest of it through." She did not reach for him. Some instinct told her that the moment wasn't hers to close. Not yet, but she did not move away either, and let the silence between them hold whatever weight it needed to. "You should go," he said eventually, though his voice carried none of the command it usually did when he gave her instructions, "before the household wakes and finds you here." I would not have your name attached to whatever they imagine happened in this room tonight. Is that an order, Your Grace? She asked, and found she was almost smiling, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. It's a request, he said, the first one I believe I have ever made of you rather than demanded. She rose stiffly, her body aching from a night spent on cold stone, and paused at the threshold of the outer door long enough to look back at him, still kneeling in the gray light, still looking faintly disbelieving of his own hands. For what it's worth, she said. I would stay again, if it came to that. She did not wait for his answer. She was not entirely certain, walking back down the corridor with the sun finally breaking properly over the eastern wall, that she was ready to hear it. Spring came to Ashvale, hold the way it came to places that had forgotten how to expect it, reluctantly, in small increments as though the castle itself needed convincing. Raven began seeking her out in daylight hours, now a habit that unsettled the rest of the household more than either of them, acknowledged aloud, and Wren found herself in his private garden more evenings than not, ostensibly to tend the herbs no other servant was trusted with, actually because he had taken to finding reasons to be wherever she was. The garden itself told its own quiet story, if a person knew how to read it. Beds gone to seed and bramble around the edges, but a single row nearest the south wall kept clear and turned, as though someone had continued tending one small corner of it out of habit long after giving up on the rest. Wren asked him about it once, and he told her, simply, that his mother had planted that row before he was born, and that some things a person keeps alive less out of hope than out of an unwillingness to be the one who finally lets them die. She thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she turned over the pressed orchard blossom she still kept beneath her pillow. They fell into an easy rhythm, neither of them named aloud, she working the soil, he sitting nearby with a stack of correspondence he rarely read, finding reasons to ask her questions about nothing in particular, the weather, the taste of a particular root, whether Larkspire's winters had been as unkind as Ashvale's. She answered carefully at first, giving him the smallest true things, and found, to her own surprise, that the smallest true things kept wanting to become larger ones. It was easier to be honest with a man who had already seen the worst shape she'd ever glimpsed of him and had not, in the end, needed her to look away. It was in that garden, among the dead beds he'd let go, untended for a decade, that he told her the rest of it, not because she asked, but because the silence between them had grown too full to hold anything back. 11 years ago, in the last month before the curse settled into him permanently, he had lost control in front of the one person who had never been afraid of him. His younger brother, sword-trained and reckless, and utterly certain the curse would never touch him. Raven did not describe what happened next. He didn't need to. The way his hands went still on the herb bed, the way his voice dropped into something too careful to be casual, told her everything the words refused to. I emptied the castle after that, he said. Every servant, every guard, everyone who might one day stand close enough to matter. It seemed like the only honest thing left to do. What happened to him? Wren asked, quietly, because 6 years of guarding her own losses had taught her exactly how much a question like that could cost, and she wanted him to know she understood the price before she asked him to pay it. He lived, Raven said, after a long moment. That was somehow worse than the alternative. For a while, he carries the marks still. He does not speak to me, not since, though I hear from his letters to our mother's steward that he has built a quiet life somewhere in the eastern provinces, married, a daughter now. I have never gone to see them. I tell myself it is to protect them. I suspect most days it is simply easier than facing what I did. He turned a piece of dead root over in his hands, not looking at her. You are the first person in 11 years I have let close enough to ask me what happened to him. Everyone else has had the good sense to let the silence stand. I have never had much use for good sense, Ren said. It tends to be the excuse people give for not asking the questions that actually matter. And then you let a maid with a bounty on her head into your private wing, Ren said gentler than she meant it, and told her to stay. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has spent a decade nailing shut, only to find it standing open anyway. I told myself it was because you already understood arithmetic, that you'd calculated the risk and decided my protection outweighed it. I don't think that was the whole truth. She was in danger of wanting to know the rest of that sentence more than she had wanted anything in 6 years, and that frightened her nearly as much as the creature in the dark ever had. She busied her hands with the herb bed instead, and when he reached to help her untangle a stubborn root, his fingers closed briefly over hers. Not by accident, not quite deliberate either. The first voluntary tenderness he had offered her in daylight, small and almost apologetic, as though he expected her to flinch. She didn't. Par. There was an evening not long after, when he found her in the garden after a council session had clearly gone badly. His shoulders set in a way she had learned to recognize, the particular tightness of a man holding a great deal in check. He sat beside her without a word for a long while, watching her hands work the soil, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't about the council at all. "You never talk about wanting to leave," he said. "Every servant in this castle dreams of somewhere else. You never have. Why?" She considered the question longer than she needed to, mostly because the honest answer surprised her when she found it. "Because for 6 years leaving meant surviving. Every place I stayed too long eventually turned dangerous, so I trained myself never to want anywhere enough to mourn it when I lost it." She looked up at him, at the careful stillness he still hadn't entirely let go of, even in daylight. "This is the first place that hasn't turned dangerous yet. I suppose I'm waiting to see if it will." "It won't," he said, with a certainty that surprised them both, and reached over to tuck a loose strand of hair back from her face. An unhurried, deliberate touch. Nothing accidental left in it now. "You are, I think, the first genuinely beautiful thing that has grown in this garden in 11 years, and I intend to keep it that way." She hadn't expected that, the word landing somewhere. She hadn't braced for it, and she felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the spring sun. That's a very poetic thing for a man who spends most nights as something with claws to say. "I contain multitudes," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved into something that was almost a smile, and she found herself smiling back before she could stop it. It was 2 days later, in the corridor outside the kitchens, that Caswick found her alone and closed a hand hard around her wrist. "The king's patience with your uncle's treaty runs out in a fortnight," he said, low and pleasant in the way that had always meant danger. "After that, niece, I stopped being generous about the bounty. I'd start planning your next disappearance if I were you." "You were never generous," Ren said low, refusing to let him see how hard her heart was working against her ribs. "You were only ever waiting for the moment it stopped costing you anything." Caswick's grip tightened, his pleasant mask thinning at the edges. "Careful. You're still, beneath whatever the king has decided to call you, a girl with a bounty and no army to protect her. Kindness has a season. Niece. Yours is nearly over." He was still holding her wrist when a shadow fell over both of them, and Revon's voice, quieter than she'd ever heard it and twice as dangerous, said a single word into the space between them. "Mine." Dax Craw's hand dropped as though it had been burned. He recovered himself quickly, the way he always did, offering a shallow bow and some empty pleasantry about respecting the king's household before retreating down the corridor, with his composure only slightly worse for wear. Wren stood very still after he'd gone, her wrist still faintly aching where his fingers had been, and found she could not quite make herself look at Ravan. "You didn't have to do that?" she said finally. "I am aware," he said. "I did it anyway." When she finally met his eyes, she found none of the careful distance he usually kept there, only a kind of fierce, unguarded worry that told her the single word in the corridor had cost him something to say aloud in front of witnesses, where anyone might have heard it and drawn their own conclusions. "He will not touch you again while I am able to prevent it. I should have said that plainly months ago, instead of leaving you to face him alone in corridors." "You've been rather occupied being cursed," she said, gentler than the words alone suggested, and was rewarded with something that was almost, that same rare smile. The council chamber was full the morning Caswick made his move, and Wren understood the moment she was summoned into it that whatever protection Ravan had built around her over the winter was about to be tested by something no private garden could shield her from. Her uncle stood at the center of the room with a folded document in one hand and an expression of practiced regret on his face, the same expression he'd worn the day he signed away her father's lands. "I bring this forward with a heavy heart," he said to the assembled council and to Ravan, seated at the head of the long table, with his face carefully arranged into something unreadable. "The girl serving in your Grace's private wing is not a common maid. She is the last living heir of House Larkspire, smuggled from her homeland under false name, and, I have reason to believe, given certain irregularities in your household these past months, not entirely innocent of intentions against the crown that shelters her." He produced the folded document with a flourish practiced enough to suggest he had rehearsed the gesture and read from it in the measured, sorrowful tone of a man who believed himself entirely reasonable. An account of forged household records of a servant's sudden and unexplained proximity to the crown. Tough irregularities in the West Wing's staffing that a suspicious mind might read as something far more dangerous than romance. None of it was entirely false. That, Wren understood watching the council's faces shift as he spoke, was precisely what made it so effective. The accusation landed exactly as Caswick had built it, to land half-true enough to be believed, twisted just enough to turn Ravenscourt against the one person who had spent a winter learning not to fear him. A council lord she barely recognized rose to demand her removal from the palace grounds pending investigation. Another, older, murmured that any household harboring an unregistered Larkspire heir was itself in violation of a dozen treaties older than the current king's reign. Wren stood in the center of the chamber and felt the particular vertigo of watching a room decide, all at once, that she was a problem rather than a person. She had felt this before, once in a hall very much like this one, the day her father's seal was broken. She had not expected to feel it again in a castle she had let herself foolishly begin to think of as safe. She watched the council's faces shift from curiosity to suspicion in the space of a single sentence, and when she looked to Ravan for the word that would end this the way mine had ended it in the corridor, she found him silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the table rather than on her. She waited. The silence stretched long enough that she understood, with a sick clarity, that it was not going to break in her favor. He expected, she realized, with a cold drop in her chest worse than anything Caswick had ever managed. He expected the accusation to be at least partly true. 11 years of being feared for what he could not control had taught him to believe the worst of anyone who got close enough to matter, and now, faced with proof that she had hidden something from him too, That old lesson was winning. She wanted to shout across the chamber that hiding a name was not the same as hiding a knife, that 6 years of survival had taught her exactly which secrets kept a person alive. But the words caught behind a throat gone tight with a betrayal she hadn't braced herself for. She had prepared walking into this arrangement for her uncle's cruelty. She had never once prepared for the king's doubt. She was escorted from the West Wing that same afternoon back to the servants' quarters she had left in autumn, and the cold of the corridor felt different this time. Not the curse's cold, but the ordinary cold of being unwanted. She had been prepared, walking into this castle 6 years ago, for cruelty. She had not been prepared for this particular flavor of it, a king's silence where his voice should have been. Word reached her within 2 days, the way word always traveled through a castle's servants faster than any official channel, that the king had not slept, that he had ordered the West Wing's candles left unlit again for the first time since winter, that he had refused 3 separate audiences with his own council. She did not know, and would not know until much later, that he had spent that first night standing outside the very door he'd once forbidden her to pass, turning her words over and over, making yourself alone in the dark so no one else has to be afraid of you is just a different kind of cruelty, until the accusation in them had finally found its mark. She only knew that the silence from the West Wing felt, for the first time in months, like the silence of a man who had also lost something he hadn't expected to. The old servants' wing had not changed in the months she'd been gone, though she felt like a different woman walking back into it, the same narrow beds, the same drafty window, the same 2 maids who had once traded theories about her in the dark, now regarding her with a wary, uncertain sympathy neither of them quite knew how to voice. One of them, an older woman named ID, who had shared bread with Wren through her first hungry winter in the castle, found her that evening with a bowl of stew she hadn't asked for, and sat with her while she ate it, saying nothing useful, offering only the particular comfort of a presence that did not require explanation. "He didn't defend you," Ide said eventually, not unkindly, more like a woman naming a wound so it could finally be tended. The whole hall's talking of nothing else. "No," Wren agreed. "He didn't. And you still love him." It wasn't a question, and Wren didn't answer it as one. She only turned the empty bowl over in her hands and thought of a lullaby, sung into the dark to a creature that had not, in the end, been the thing she needed protecting from. "For what it's worth," Ide said, rising to take the bowl from her, "I never believed a word your uncle said. Neither did half this castle, whatever the council chooses to do about it. You scrubbed floors beside the rest of us for 6 years without ever once putting on airs about who you used to be. That counts for something, even if it doesn't count for enough tonight." "Thank you," Wren said, and meant it more than the small words could carry. She sat alone for a long while after ID left, listening to the castle settle into its night sounds around her, and found herself, for the first time in months, missing the particular cold of the West Wing corridor. Not the curse's cold, but the cold of a place that had, however briefly, felt like it belonged to her. She could have run. It occurred to her, sitting alone in the dark of the servants' wing with Caswick's guards posted outside her door by morning, that this was precisely the moment a smarter woman would have taken whatever was left of her freedom and disappeared into the countryside before the bounty caught up with her properly. But running was what her whole life had trained her to do, and she was tired, bone tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, of being someone who only ever survived by disappearing. She thought of the garden's single-tended row, kept alive out of stubbornness more than hope, and understood that she would rather be burned for staying than survive one more year of vanishing. The opportunity came at the treaty's formal renewal, held in the great hall with every lord of both houses in attendance. Caswick presiding over the ceremony with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. The hall had been dressed for the occasion in a way Wren had never seen it. Banners of both houses hung side by side, the long tables crowded with witnesses from every corner of both territories, the particular formal hush of an event too important for anyone present to risk speaking out of turn. She had been given no seat, no place among the household she had once briefly belonged to. She stood instead near the hall's edge among the ordinary servants, close enough to watch, far enough to be forgotten, exactly the way Caswick had always preferred her. Wren was brought forward as evidence, proof of Larkspire's stolen heir, proof of Ashvale's harbored deception. And it was in that moment, surrounded by a hall full of people who had already decided what she was, that she understood the only way out of this was through the truth she had spent 6 years burying. Caswick unfurled his document with the ceremony of a man who had rehearsed the gesture in front of a mirror, reading aloud an account of her supposed crimes that bore only a passing resemblance to anything that had actually happened. A servant girl who had insinuated herself into the king's confidence, who carried outlawed magic she intended to use against the crown that sheltered her, who had, he claimed, orchestrated her own placement in the West Wing as the opening move of some larger scheme against House Ashvale's throne. Wren listened to her own life, narrated back to her as a villain's plot, and felt something in her chest go very still and very clear, the particular calm that sometimes arrives only after fear has run out of new ground to occupy. She looked once at Raven, seated at the head of the hall with his face schooled into unreadable stone, and understood that whatever he believed of Caswick's account, he was not going to speak first. This part, apparently, was hers alone to answer. "My name," she said loud enough to still the hall, "is not Renee. It is Roswen, of House Larkspire, and I have carried that name in silence since the day my uncle sold my family's lands to keep his own." Caswick's face went the color of old ash. What he has not told this hall is why House Larkspire's blood was worth hiding in the first place. She held out her hand and let the fire come. It had been buried as long as her name had. The ember blood of House Larkspire, outlawed a generation before her birth, the reason her family had been dismantled rather than simply defeated. Her father had told her once before Caswick's men came that fire like theirs was not a weapon so much as a truth a person carried in their blood, and that the danger had never been the fire itself, but what frightened men chose to do with anyone who carried it. She had not let herself believe that story in 6 years of scrubbing floors. She let herself believe it now, in front of a hall that had already decided what she was, because the alternative was disappearing one final time, and she had run out of places left to disappear to. Flame curled along her palm without burning her gold and steady, and in the stunned silence that followed, she turned to where Raven sat, his expression unreadable, and said the thing she had never let herself say aloud. "I am in danger of loving you. I have been for months. I hid the crown because I was afraid of what it would cost me. I am done being afraid of that particular cost." The curse chose that exact moment to answer her, as though her fire had called it forward, Ravan's control breaking in front of the full council, the shift beginning before he could excuse himself from the room the way he'd trained himself to for 11 years. The hall dissolved into panic, guards reaching for weapons, Caswick already shouting for someone to seize the moment and call it proof of everything he claimed. Lords who had spent a decade whispering about the Demon King's cursed nights now watched it happen in daylight, in front of witnesses, and Wren understood in that instant that this was precisely the moment Caswick had been waiting for all along. Not her exposure, but his. Wren did not run. She had never run from this. not once, and she was not going to start in front of the one audience that mattered least. She crossed the hall with her fire still burning gold along her palm, guards and lords alike scrambling out of her path, and pressed it flat against his chest over the place where a decade of guilt had calcified into something no ordinary magic could touch, and let the ember blood do what it had been forbidden to do for a generation. The fire did not hurt him. It burned through the dark threading of the curse, instead, gently, the way flame burns through old rope, not destroying, but freeing what it had bound. He came back to himself on his knees, in the middle of the council hall, human hands pressed to hers, breathing hard, and the guilt in his face when he finally looked up at her was not for the curse. It was for the silence he'd let stand between them. The hall had gone entirely quiet by then, the particular hush of a room that has just watched something it cannot yet name. Gold firelight still fading from her palm where it rested against his chest, both of them kneeling in the wreckage of a ceremony that had been meant to end her, and somewhere at the edges of the chamber. The first cracking sound of a man's certainty finally giving way. "I should have trusted you," Ravan said, low enough that it belonged only to her. "I let 11 years of fear speak louder than one winter of proof." Doc Caswick tried once more to salvage the room, appealing to the council for the girl's arrest as a fugitive of Larkspire law, and it was his own nephew, the young lord, who had stood silent at his shoulder through every treaty negotiation, and who had watched his uncle's cruelty accumulate for years without daring to name it, who stepped forward and told the council the truth of how House Larkspire's lands had actually been lost. The evidence he offered, quiet and devastating, unraveled a decade of Caswick's lies in the space of a single testimony. The council stripped Caswick of his title within the week, his own family's testimony leaving him nothing to appeal to. Doc Caswick's nephew, the same young lord who had broken his silence in the treaty hall, testified further before the full council in the days that followed, a careful, damning account of years spent watching his uncle divert Larkspire's revenues, falsify its accounts, and finally engineer the very treaty renewal that had been meant to seal Roswyn's fate. Doc Caswick himself said little in his own defense once the testimony began. Whatever composure had carried him through 30 years of quiet cruelty seemed to have deserted him entirely once his own family stopped protecting the lie. He was escorted from Ashvale Hold under guard within the week, stripped of every title he had ever claimed, and Roswyn found, watching him go, that she felt neither triumph nor mercy toward him, only a distant, exhausted relief that the arithmetic of her life no longer had to account for him at all. The bounty on House Larkspire's blood was dissolved by royal decree before the ink on the old treaty had even dried. What lands remained of her father's holdings? Modest, now diminished by a decade of Caswick's mismanagement, but hers by blood and by law both, were returned to her name within the month, though she found, turning the deed over in her hands, that she felt less triumph in it than she'd expected. The lands mattered less than the simple fact of no longer needing to hide what she was. Wren stood in the West Wing's outer chamber that evening, her own chamber now, the door to it no longer forbidden, and watched Ravan light every candle in the room himself, one by one, as though testing whether the dark still had the same power over either of them. It didn't, not entirely. The curse had not vanished. Some bindings, he told her, ran too deep for even ember blood to burn away completely, and there were still nights, rarer now, when the old shape reasserted itself, and she sat with him, through the worst of it, unafraid, the way she had the very first time. But something in its grip had loosened the night she refused to run, and loosened further still the day she chose to be seen. He no longer emptied the castle at dusk. He no longer needed to, because he had finally let someone stay close enough to help carry what 11 years of solitude had convinced him he had to carry alone. "I have spent 11 years being a king that people are afraid of," he said, taking her hand the way he had in the garden, deliberate this time, no apology in it. "I would like to spend whatever comes next being one that a certain servant girl with a stolen name decided to stay for." "Roswin," she reminded him, and found she liked the sound of her own name in his mouth after 6 years of hiding it in everyone else's. "Roswin," he agreed, and said it like a claim he intended to keep. 3 seasons later, the orchard behind Ashvale, Hold's east wall, had begun to bear fruit for the first time in a decade, planted the spring after the treaty fell apart, and Caswick's name stopped mattering to anyone. Roswin stood among the young trees with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, ember blood no longer a secret she needed to keep folded into a servant's lining, and watched Ravin cross the garden toward her the way he did most evenings now, unhurried, unafraid of being seen in whatever light the hour offered. The garden's one tended row had grown into a dozen now, his mother's herbs, joined by the first larkspire orchard saplings Roswin had planted with her own hands the week after the Coronation Council first sat. She liked to think the two houses' plantings had begun, slowly to grow into each other along the shared border, an accident of roots, nothing more. But she found she liked the accident regardless. "The council wants a coronation date," he said, dropping into the grass beside her without ceremony. A king who had learned, slowly, that dignity and ease were not opposites. "They keep insisting a queen should be crowned properly with witnesses, and I keep telling them she was queen enough for me the night she refused to leave a locked room." "That's not a very practical coronation," she said, but she was smiling, and he caught her hand the way he'd caught it that first day in the garden, deliberate now, certain, nothing careful left in it. Idea had come to the wedding, seated near the front, despite her protests that servants belonged at the back of any hall, and Roswin had insisted otherwise, the way she had insisted on a great many small corrections to Ashvale Hold's old order since the crown had settled on her brow. Servants permitted to sit at the harvest table rather than serve it. A girl from the kitchen sent to study healing in the capital at the crown's expense. The West Wing's third door, finally, permanently propped open. She had not set out to change the castle. She had simply refused to let it go on treating people the way it had once treated her, and found, to her quiet satisfaction, that the changes had a way of compounding on their own. Sometimes in the evenings, Ravin still found her in the orchard longer than the work required, and she still let him, the way she let herself linger, at an outer hearth a lifetime ago, feeding a fire that hadn't strictly needed tending. He no longer kept himself angled from the light, he no longer needed to. And on the rare nights when the old curse still surfaced, she no longer sat outside a locked door waiting, she simply stayed beside him, unafraid, the way she always had. Until the shape of him settled back into something the whole castle had finally learned not to fear. She thought sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when old habits still occasionally pulled her toward the door, of the girl who had spent 6 years scrubbing floors and answering to a name that fit in no one's mouth but her own hiding. That girl was not gone. Exactly, she had simply stopped needing to disappear. She kept the pressed orchard blossom still, tucked now into the lining of a queen's gown rather than a servant's sleeve, not because she needed reminding of what she'd survived, but because some things a person keeps alive less out of grief than out of gratitude for how far they'd carried her. When the first frost of the new year dusted the orchard's youngest branches, Roswin stood in it with her husband's hand in hers, and the crown of house larkspire, reforged, ember-touched, finally worn in daylight, resting easy on her brow, and understood, watching her breath fog gently in the cold air beside his, that the impossible task had never really been calming a cursed king in the dark. It had been believing, after 6 years of disappearing that she was worth staying for. Thank you so much for listening to this story, every word of it, from the first cold floor to the last frost on the orchard. If you enjoy these stories and would like to support the channel and get access to exclusive content I share there, you can find me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Let me know what you thought. I always read your comments, and they mean more than you know.